The morning I left, I took the pie with me. It was a butter tart pie, the kind my mother used to make every Christmas, the kind that takes 3 hours if you do it properly, which I always did. I had made it the night before in my daughter-in-law's kitchen, using my own mixing bowls that I'd brought from storage, because she had told me once, very pleasantly, that she didn't like anyone else touching her things. I had stood at her counter, rolled the pastry on a sheet of parchment paper so I wouldn't leave a mark, and I had made that pie the way my mother taught me, the way I had made it for 40 years. And when Sandra told me, right there in front of her book club friends sitting at the dining room table, that dessert would be served after the guests had eaten, that I should wait in the sunroom until they were finished, I looked at her for a long moment. Then I went to the kitchen, put on my coat, picked up the pie in both hands, and walked out the side door into the November cold. I drove to my friend Dorothy's house on the other side of Guelph. Dorothy opened the door in her housecoat, took one look at me standing on her porch holding a pie, and said, "Put the kettle on, I'll get forks." I want to tell you how I got to that moment, because it didn't begin with the pie. It never begins with the thing that finally breaks you. My name is Margaret. I am 68 years old. I spent 31 years teaching grade 4 at an elementary school in Guelph, Ontario, and I retired the spring before my husband passed. My husband's name was Gerald, and we were married for 42 years, and when he died of a heart attack on a Tuesday in February, I thought for a long time that I would not know how to be a person without him. Gerald and I had one son. His name is Kevin. We raised him in the house on Aramosa Road, the same house where I still live, or where I was still living, up until about 8 months before all of this happened. Kevin grew up there, learned to ride his bike in that driveway, brought home his first girlfriend, and cried at the kitchen table the night his father died. Kevin is a good man. I want to be clear about that, because this story could make him sound like something he isn't. He is good, and he is kind, and he loves me. But he married Sandra 5 years ago, and Sandra is a particular kind of person. The kind who never says anything cruel, not exactly, but who arranges things so that you feel small without ever being able to point to the moment it happened. She is an office manager at a dental practice in Waterloo. She is organized and efficient, and the house is always clean. She remembers everyone's birthdays and sends cards. At Christmas, she puts out coordinated decorations, silver and white, no red, because she read somewhere that red was dated. She told me this while looking at my box of Gerald's old red ornaments, the ones our son had grown up hanging on the tree. She didn't say anything directly. She never did. After Gerald died, Kevin called me every Sunday. Then, after a while, Sandra started joining those calls, and they got shorter. Then they moved. They bought a new house in a subdivision outside of Waterloo, 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a double garage, the kind of house that looks like 12 other houses on the same street. Kevin called to tell me about it, excited the way he used to get excited about things when he was small. "Mom, there's a room for you," he said, "if you ever want to come stay." I thanked him. I told him I was fine in my house. And I was. For a while. The winter after Gerald died was the longest of my life. I am not someone who complains. My mother raised me to believe that complaining was a kind of self-indulgence, but I will tell you the truth here, because I think it matters. That winter, I would sometimes go 2 or 3 days without speaking to another adult. The school I had retired from sent a card. The neighbors waved from driveways. Dorothy called once a week, sometimes twice. But there is a specific kind of silence in a house where someone used to be and now isn't, and after a while that silence starts to have a weight to it. Kevin called in February, on the anniversary of his father's death. He sounded worried about me. Sandra got on the phone and said they had plenty of space, that the room was just sitting there, that it would be good for all of them. She said it would be temporary, just to get through the worst of the winter. I said yes because I was tired of the silence, and because I thought Kevin needed me nearby as much as I needed him, and because Sandra sounded warm on the phone. I put my house on a long-term rental through a property management company in Guelph, a decision I am grateful for every single day. As it turned out, and I packed 3 suitcases and my mixing bowls, and I drove to Waterloo. The first few weeks were all right. Sandra had made up the guest room nicely. There were fresh towels. She showed me where everything was in the kitchen and said to help myself to anything. Kevin and I watched hockey on Friday nights, the way we used to when he was a teenager. But I began to notice small things. When I cooked, which I did often because I liked to cook, and because I thought it was a fair contribution to the household, Sandra would come into the kitchen afterward and wipe down the counters in a specific way, not because they were dirty, but in the way you wipe down a surface to mark it as yours again. She never said anything. She would hum quietly and wipe, and I would stand there not knowing what to do with my hands. When Kevin's colleagues came for dinner, Sandra seated me at the far end of the table, near the kitchen doorway. She introduced me to people as Kevin's mom, and then turned the conversation in another direction before I could say much. Once, at a dinner party, I made a comment about a news story I'd been following, something about municipal politics in the region, and Sandra smiled at me the way you smile at a child who has said something endearing and moved on. I began to feel like a guest who had overstayed. Not because anyone said so, but you can feel it. The way the air changes in a house when your presence in it is merely tolerated. Kevin didn't see it, or didn't want to. He was working long hours at the engineering firm, a big project, a tight deadline. When he came home, he was tired, and Sandra managed the household, and the household included me. I tried to talk to him once, on a Saturday morning when Sandra was out. I sat down at the kitchen table and I said, "Kevin, I want to make sure I'm not in the way here." He looked up from his coffee and told me not to be ridiculous. He said I was family. He said Sandra loved having me there. He looked so tired, and so earnest, and so much like his father, when his father used to reassure me about things, that I couldn't push further. So, I kept quiet. I helped with dinner. I stayed out of Sandra's way. I watched more television than I had watched in 40 years of my adult life. I called Dorothy and described the curtains in the guest room in too much detail because there wasn't much else to describe. And then I met my granddaughter. That's the part I haven't told you yet. Kevin and Sandra had a daughter, Lily, who was 9 years old when I moved in. Lily was a serious, thoughtful child who read constantly and had opinions about everything, and reminded me, in the best possible way, of myself at that age. She was also, I noticed early on, somewhat lonely in the quiet, organized way that children in very tidy houses sometimes are. Lily started coming to my room in the evenings, after dinner. She would knock very politely, which her mother had clearly taught her, and then she would come in and sit on the edge of the bed and ask me questions. She asked me about being a teacher. She asked me what Guelph was like. She asked me about her grandfather, Gerald, and I told her stories about him that made her laugh, which was the best thing I had done in a long time. We started doing things together. I taught her to bake. She was methodical and careful, which are exactly the qualities that make a good baker. On Saturdays, when Kevin was at the office and Sandra had her errands, Lily and I would take the bus to the library. Because I had given up my car when I moved, another decision I would rethink later, and Lily knew all the librarians by name. We would stay for 2 hours. Lily would get a stack of books and I would sit in the periodicals section and read the Globe and Mail the way I hadn't since Gerald died. Sandra noticed the friendship and seemed pleased by it, in theory. She said things like, "It's so good for her to have you here," at moments that felt like they were meant for my benefit. But I also noticed that when Lily told stories at dinner about things we'd done together, Sandra would redirect the conversation gently. And once, coming back from the library, I heard her tell Lily that she didn't want her to bother me too much. Lily looked at me as Sandra went back to the kitchen. I shook my head slightly. Lily nodded slightly. It was the first conspiracy we'd had. The book club started in September. Sandra had a group of 6 women who came to the house one Thursday evening per month. They were all approximately Sandra's age, mid-40s, and they were uniformly polished and pleasant, and they laughed at each other's jokes with great consistency. Sandra prepared food for these evenings: charcuterie boards, something with brie, wine from the Niagara region because Sandra appreciated local products. The first 2 times I stayed in my room, I read. I heard them laughing. It was fine. The third time, Sandra knocked on my door in the afternoon and asked if I would like to join them for part of the evening. She said it in the way she said most things, pleasantly, efficiently, and I thought it was a genuine offer, so I said yes. I asked if I could bring something. I offered to make my butter tart pie. I should tell you that my butter tart pie is not a modest thing. The recipe came from my mother, who got it from her mother, who apparently won a county fair competition with it sometime in the 1950s. It is the kind of pie that people request by name. Dorothy has been requesting it for 15 years. Kevin, growing up, used to hide slices in the back of the fridge behind the leftover containers so his friends wouldn't eat them all. It is the pie I am known for. Sandra said that would be lovely. I spent most of that Thursday making it. I went out in the morning on foot, a 40-minute walk, to get the proper pastry flour from the bulk food store, because the all-purpose in Sandra's pantry would not give the same result. I made the filling from scratch, the way it's meant to be made, with real butter and proper brown sugar and a careful hand. I cooled it properly. I brought it out of my room at 7:30, on a stand, because it's the kind of pie that should be presented on a stand. Sandra's friends made the appropriate sounds. One of them asked for the recipe immediately, which is always a good sign. Sandra said it smelled wonderful. We were all standing in the kitchen for a moment, and I felt, for the first time in months, like myself. Then Sandra touched my arm lightly and said, "We're going to start the discussion now. Why don't you go relax? We'll have dessert once we've finished up, and you can join us then." I looked at her. "When will that be?" "Oh, probably around 9. She smiled. "It's just that the discussion runs long sometimes. You know how it is. We'll call you when we're ready." 9 o'clock, in my room, waiting to be called. I am 68 years old. I taught school for 31 years. I served on the board of our local library. I helped raise funds that built a new gymnasium at Kevin's elementary school. I once chaired a regional conference for 300 educators and did not once let the schedule run more than 4 minutes over, and I was being asked to wait in my room until I was summoned. "Of course," I said. "Of course." I went back to my room. I sat on the edge of the bed. I could hear them talking, laughing, opening another bottle of wine. I looked at the stand I had brought in with me. I had forgotten to leave the pie in the kitchen. I sat there for 22 minutes. I know because I was looking at the clock on the nightstand, the small one with Gerald's handwriting on a piece of tape on the back, his initials and mine, G+M, written in permanent marker when we were packing up a house after a trip and had mixed up our travel clocks. I had brought that clock with me from Aramosa Road in one of my 3 suitcases. I always bring it. At 22 minutes, I stood up. I put on my coat. I picked up the pie. I took my purse from the hook behind the door, where I had started keeping it because the hook on the back of the closet felt too permanent. I found Dorothy's number in my contacts. "Are you home?" I said when she picked up. "Yes, why? Are you all right? I'm going to come over. I have pie." I went through the kitchen without looking at the dining room. I heard a pause in the conversation. I think one of them saw me, but I did not stop. I went out the side door and stood on the step in the November dark and called a cab, because I no longer had a car and the buses didn't run at that hour. And I waited on the step with the pie in my hands until the headlights came up the driveway. Dorothy lives in a semi-detached on Edinburgh Road South. She is my age, recently widowed herself, and she has the quality I value most in a person. She does not fuss. She heated the kettle. She got forks. She sat down at her kitchen table and said, "Tell me." So I told her. Not just about the pie and the book club, but about the 8 months before that, the counter-wiping, the dinner parties, the way Sandra had started CCing Kevin on emails she sent me about household schedules, as though I needed supervision, the way I had felt myself getting quieter and quieter, taking up less space, staying in my room more. "You still have your house," Dorothy said. It wasn't a question. "The tenants are on a 12-month lease. It ends in March. Dorothy poured more tea. So you have a plan? I think I do now. Dorothy cut another slice of pie. You know what I think? I think that woman knew exactly what she was doing. I think small cruelties like that are never accidental. I thought about that. I thought about how Sandra had never once been unkind in any way I could specifically name, how she had always had a reasonable explanation, how she had said, many times, that she was glad I was there, in the same tone you might use to express gladness about a parking spot. I don't know that it was cruelty, I said. I think she just never saw me as a full person. I was Kevin's mother, a guest who cooked. That's enough, Dorothy said. That's more than enough. I called Kevin from Dorothy's living room that night. He picked up after 2 rings, and I could tell immediately that Sandra had told him something, because his voice had that particular careful quality it gets when he is trying to stay neutral. Mom, where are you? Sandra said you left. I'm at Dorothy's. I'm fine. A pause. What happened? Nothing specific happened, Kevin. I kept my voice calm. I had been a teacher for 31 years. I know how to keep my voice calm. I've been thinking for a while now that it might be time for me to go home. The tenant's lease is up in March. I'm going to go back to Guelph. Mom, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to. I want to sleep in my own house and cook in my own kitchen and walk to my own library. Another pause. Longer this time. Did Sandra do something? I thought about how to answer that for a moment. Sandra didn't do anything I can point to. But I've been shrinking, Kevin. I've been making myself smaller for 8 months, and I didn't notice until tonight, and I don't want to do it anymore. He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was different, softer. Dad would have said something sooner, he said. Your father had a gift for saying things at exactly the right moment. I smiled into the phone. I took a little longer, but I got there. He came to Dorothy's the next morning without Sandra. We sat at Dorothy's kitchen table and we talked for 2 hours, properly, the way we hadn't talked since before Sandra started joining the Sunday calls. I told him I loved him. I told him none of this was about him. I told him that Lily was a remarkable child and that he should make sure she has room to be remarkable, which he seemed to understand. He cried a little, which I hadn't expected. He said he was sorry. I told him he had nothing to be sorry for, which wasn't entirely true, but it was what he needed to hear right then. He helped me pack my things from the house the following weekend. Sandra was polite throughout in the way that she always was. I thanked her for having me. She said, of course, anytime. Lily called me on the phone, her first solo phone call. She informed me very formally 3 days after I got back to Guelph. The tenants had left the house in perfectly good condition, and I had spent 2 days putting everything back exactly where it belonged, including Gerald's red ornaments, which I had kept in a box in my storage room in Waterloo and brought home on the back seat of Kevin's car. Lily said, Grandma, I want to make the butter tart pie. I said, Then you'll have to come to Guelph. She said, I know. Can I come on the first weekend of December? I said yes. I already had the pastry flour. She came with Kevin, without Sandra, who had, Kevin reported, a workshop that weekend. Lily stood at my kitchen counter with an apron that came down to her knees and measured everything with great seriousness. She asked questions the whole time, which is what good students do. She asked why you have to chill the butter. She asked what happens to the filling if you overbake it. She asked if great-great-grandma really won a competition. Second place, I told her. She always said the woman who won first had been on the committee. Lily found this extremely satisfying. When the pie came out, we stood at the counter and ate 2 slices each before dinner, which is something Sandra would never have permitted. Kevin wandered in from the living room and had a slice and said, This is exactly what it's always tasted like, which is, if you understand baking, the highest possible compliment. We put the Christmas tree up after dinner. I got out the box of Gerald's ornaments, the red ones, and Lily held each one up and asked about it. And I told her the story of each one I could remember, and Kevin sat on the couch and watched, and I could see his face doing something complicated and important that it needed to do. It is April now. I am back in my house on Aramosa Road. Dorothy and I have started walking every morning when the weather permits, which in Guelph at this time of year is not always, but we go anyway, and we have coffee after at the place on Wyndham Street that makes it properly. I have signed up to volunteer at the library on Tuesday afternoons. I am considering very seriously going back to supply teaching in the fall, because I miss children, and because I have more to give than any sunroom in Waterloo could have contained. My house smells like my house. I sleep well. I wake up in the morning, and the first thing I see is Gerald's travel clock on the nightstand, G+M in permanent marker, and I say good morning to him the way I've done since the day he died, because I figure it costs nothing and there's no one here to think it strange. Kevin calls every Sunday. Lily calls whenever she has something to tell me, which is often, because she is a child who finds the world constantly worth reporting. She has started reading the books I recommend, and last week she called to tell me she was angry about the ending of a book, which meant she had read it all the way through and cared about it, so I told her that was exactly the right response. Sandra sent a text last month saying she hoped I had settled in well. I replied that I had. That was our entire conversation, and it felt, for the first time, like an honest one. I want to say one more thing, and I want to say it to anyone who might need to hear it. There is a particular kind of diminishment that happens so gradually you don't notice it until you're sitting in a guest room waiting to be called for dessert. It doesn't come with raised voices or obvious cruelty. It comes with reasonable explanations, with pleasant tones, with the steady accumulation of moments in which you are moved slightly to the side. And because no single moment is enough to point to, you start to believe that you are the problem, that you are too sensitive, too present, too much. You are not too much. You have never been too much. I am 68 years old. I have made butter tart pie for 4 decades. I have shaped the minds of more children than I can count. I have sat beside my husband in a hospital room and held his hand while he left me, and I survived that, and I am still here, walking to the library on Tuesday afternoons and drinking coffee on Wyndham Street and calling my granddaughter back whenever she phones. I walked out with the pie. I would do it again tomorrow.